The 2014 vintage in Burgundy is, in my opinion, in my early opinion, a very cool vintage. Not cool like cold climate, but a vintage that I expect is going to be a really nice vintage, and a really nice vintage that people talk about for years to come. It's not a classically great vintage in that it's not, you know, kind of a big forward ripe kind of vintage. It is a classically great vintage in, I think, kind of an older school Burgundy sort of sense, in that they're wines that have a lot of freshness and a lot of elegance, and if you like sort of historically classic Burgundies, I think a great vintage. It's a vintage. It's a funny vintage as far as kind of the climate. It's a vintage that started off really early and really warm in the spring. They had really early bud break and flowering, and the farmers, the grape growers, thought that, okay, here we go, and we're going to have a really early harvest because they'd had such an early kind of beginning to things. And then they had, after a couple months of that, kind of the start of things starting really quickly and really warm, even hot, they then had a very cool middle of the summer, which really slowed things down, and, you know, kind of flipped the sense of the vintage from a vintage that, you know, that might be really early, or that was likely to be really early as far as harvest times. Flipped it really to a vintage where, oh goodness, now we're starting to get worried that things are going to get ripe. But then in the fall, they actually had a really nice and really warm, not too hot, but kind of warm, mild fall that really helped things along. And so the end result of that was they had nice long hang time, so they had really, you know, nice phenolic maturity on the wines. But you know, cooler temperatures, you know, late in the season, in the middle and towards the end of the season, such that they had, you know, really nice acidity, really nice balance to the wines. There's a lot of talk in the press right now, particularly about the 2014 whites. And the whites are superb in that, you know, bright and fresh, you know, great acidity, great kind of mineral framing, very much a terroir-driven vintage where you can really get a sense for the different sites, and the Saint-Aubins taste like Saint-Aubins, and the Chassagne tastes like Chassagne, and the Meursault tastes like Meursault. It's a really great kind of terroir-driven vintage for Burgundy, and the whites are absolutely as fantastic as advertised. The one thing I would say, having just come back from France, is if you're someone who values elegance in your enjoyment of red Burgundies, don't overlook the red Burgundies in 2014. They're beautiful wines. They are, you know, again, particularly with we tend to work with producers who are really focused on a more elegant style, and for those producers, they made, you know, lovely wines that, you know, that at a certain level, you know, maybe are reminiscent of the 2002s, and there's kind of bright, fresh, balanced sort of style. They're not big, they're not, you know, super fruity, super forward wines, but they're really lovely. And if you're someone who likes quiet elegance in your Burgundies, I think it's a real keeper of a vintage.